All right, so today we're going to deep dive into some pretty serious stuff. We're looking at former President Trump's comments of the January 6th committee. Specifically, his suggestion that the committee members themselves should be jailed. And we've got some spicy excerpts from a Reddit thread on a Rolling Stone article covering this whole thing. So we're going to get a glimpse of public reaction and how that's playing out alongside Trump's stance.
Yeah, it's certainly a volatile mix, especially, I mean, this comes after, his recent election win.
To say the least. So to help us break it all down, I've got an expert in political discourse with me and public sentiment, of course. You've been following Trump's rhetoric very closely. So what's your take on his latest pronouncements?
Well, according to the Rolling Stone article, Trump is advocating for the imprisonment of the January 6th committee members,
Right.
Investigating him. And he's expressing his intent to pardon those who participated in the Capitol attack. And these statements were made on Meet the Press, which, gives them some considerable weight.
Yeah, that's a pretty major platform. What kind of impact do you think it has? Choosing to say this on Meet the Press versus, say, on his own social media.
Well, Meet the Press, it provides a level of legitimacy and reach that his personal platforms just don't have. It signals that he intends these statements to be taken seriously, and he wants to engage in, mainstream political discourse. But at the same time, he's pushing this, really controversial agenda. And it's also worth noting that this isn't an isolated incident. Back in March of last year, he used Truth Social to accuse the committee of lies and treason. So this pattern kind of suggests a deliberate strategy to undermine the investigation's legitimacy and frame himself as a victim.
Okay, so he's been laying the groundwork for this for a while, but advocating for jailing your political opponents,
Yeah.
that's a pretty big leap. What are people saying about this in the Reddit thread?
Well, the reactions are predictably diverse. Some users are drawing comparisons to historical instances of political persecution, even questioning, whether it's appropriate to invoke terms like fascism in this context.
Whoa, bringing up fascism, is that a common thread in this discussion?
It's definitely present, yeah. It reflects a deep anxiety about the potential erosion of democratic norms
Yeah.
and the parallels some see with authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of historical baggage that comes with that term. What other kinds of reactions are you seeing?
Well, many are pointing out the irony of Trump calling for prosecutions while facing his own legal battles and, accusing the current administration of weaponizing the DOJ against him. This perceived hypocrisy fuels concerns about a potential double standard and a disregard for the rule of law.
It's almost like he's trying to turn the tables and say, look, they're doing it too.
Right. It plays into this narrative of being unfairly targeted,
Yeah.
persecuted by his political enemies.
So this whole idea of Trump as a victim, that seems to be a key element of his messaging here.
Absolutely. It's a powerful rhetorical tool that allows him to tap into the grievances of his supporters and frame himself as a fighter against, a corrupt establishment.
It's interesting, though, because in the Reddit thread, some users are pushing back against that.
Yeah.
They're saying it's not just about Trump as an individual, but about the broader implications for democracy.
Yeah, there's a real concern about the potential long-term consequences of his rhetoric and actions. Some argue that traditional responses like appeals to decorum and norms, they just aren't sufficient anymore, and that stronger measures are needed to protect democratic institutions.
So stronger behaviors like, what does that look like? What are some of the suggestions being floated in the thread?
Well, there's a range of ideas from calls for more aggressive legal action against Trump to proposals for, structural reforms that would limit executive power. One particularly striking suggestion is that President Biden preemptively pardon the members of the January 6th committee to shield them from potential retaliation.
Wow, that's a bold move.
Hmm.
But it does highlight the level of fear and distrust that's out there. What stands out to you the most from these reactions? Is there anything that surprised you or particularly caught your attention?
I think perhaps the most striking aspect is the sense of urgency and desperation in many of the comments. People are grappling with the question of what it means to defend democracy when faced with a leader who seems willing to disregard its fundamental principles. This raises the question of what options are available when the traditional safeguards fail to prevent abuses of power.
We were just talking about how people are reacting to Trump's pronouncements, with anxieties about democracy and calls for action and all that. But what makes this situation really complex is that it intersects with the legal and political landscape in a way that could have some, far-reaching consequences.
You're absolutely right. Trump's statements about jailing the January 6th committee members and pardoning the rioters, these aren't just rhetorical flourishes. They represent a potential course of action that would have profound implications for the balance of power and the future of American democracy.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. Let's start with the pardons. What kind of precedent would that set if he actually went through with it?
A presidential pardon is a really powerful tool. It allows the president to completely absolve someone of federal crimes. Historically, it's been used in cases of mercy, to
Hmm.
correct injustices or promote national healing. But in this case, pardoning the January 6th participants, it would send a dangerous message that attacking the very heart of American democracy has no consequences.
And what about the potential prosecution of the committee members? How would that play out, legally and politically?
That's where things get really murky. Trump doesn't have the direct power to prosecute anyone. That's the role of the Justice Department, which is supposed to operate independently. However, he could exert pressure on the DOJ to investigate and potentially bring charges against his political opponents. This would raise serious concerns about the abuse of power and the politicization of the justice system.
Some people in the Reddit thread are even suggesting that Biden preemptively pardoned the committee members to protect them from, any kind of retaliation. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a fascinating idea, albeit a legally and politically complex one. A preemptive pardon would be an unprecedented move, essentially acknowledging the very real threat of politically motivated prosecution. It would also highlight the extraordinary measures that some believe are necessary to protect democratic institutions in this current climate.
So on one hand, you have Trump potentially wielding executive power to pardon his allies and target his opponents. And on the other, you have people suggesting Biden use his own executive power. To counteract that, it's a pretty stark illustration of the power struggle that's unfolding.
It's like a high-stakes game of constitutional chess, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. The ultimate outcome will depend on a complex interplay of legal precedent, political strategy, and public pressure.
Speaking of public pressure, how do you think these developments are impacting the broader political landscape? We talked earlier about the anxieties and calls for action we're seeing in the Reddit thread.
Well, Trump's actions and the potential responses to them are further deepening the existing political divides in this country. His supporters see him as a victim fighting against a corrupt system, while his opponents view him as an existential threat to democracy. This chasm of perception makes finding common ground and engaging in constructive dialogue incredibly difficult.
It feels like we're caught in this vicious cycle. Trump's rhetoric escalates tensions, his opponents push back, and the cycle repeats, further fueling the polarization.
That's a very apt description. This cycle of escalation feeds into a broader trend of democratic backsliding. That's happening not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world.
Democratic backsliding, what does that mean exactly?
It refers to the gradual erosion of democratic norms and institutions, often through subtle or incremental steps. It can manifest in various ways, such as the weakening of checks and balances, the suppression of dissent, or the manipulation of electoral processes.
So in this context, Trump's pronouncements and potential actions could be seen as contributing to that backsliding.
Exactly. By undermining the legitimacy of the January 6th investigation, advocating for the pardon of those who attacked the Capitol, and potentially using his power to target his political opponents. He's chipping away at the foundations of American democracy.
And that brings us back to the Reddit thread. What are people saying about this? Are they recognizing this broader trend of democratic erosion?
There's definitely an awareness of the larger stakes involved. Many users express deep concern about the future of the country, fearing that Trump's actions could lead to further political violence, or even a complete breakdown of democratic norms.
Some of the comments in the thread were particularly poignant, reflecting a sense of fear, anger, and even despair.
One user wrote, "I'm starting to feel like we're living in a dystopian novel." Another said, "I'm scared for our country." And a third simply asked, "What can we do?"
Those are powerful sentiments. They capture the very real sense of anxiety and uncertainty that many Americans are feeling right now.
These anxieties are understandable. We're witnessing a profound challenge to the very principles that underpin American democracy. The question now is how we respond to this challenge, both individually and collectively.
It's a question that demands our attention. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore potential solutions and discuss what actions we can take to protect democracy. In these uncertain times, I think it's safe to say we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from Trump's those strong statements to the public reaction, and then all the potential legal and political fallout. It's a lot to process, and honestly, I imagine some listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed, or even maybe a bit hopeless.
Yeah, I understand that. When we're faced with these kinds of challenges to democracy, it's easy to feel like, what can I even do? But it's important to remember that we're not passive bystanders. We have agency. Even small actions can make a difference.
Okay, so let's talk about those actions. Where do we even begin? What can we do to protect and strengthen democracy in this kind of climate?
Well, first and foremost, it's about being informed and engaged. We need to understand the issues at stake, the historical context, and the potential consequences of different courses of action. That's what we're doing here with this deep dive, right? Trying to make sense of this whole complicated situation and equip listeners with the knowledge they need to make informed choices.
Right, knowledge is power. But what comes after knowledge? What are some concrete steps people can take to actually translate that knowledge into action?
There are many avenues for engagement, and the best approach will depend on individual circumstances and preferences, of course. But here are a few ideas.
Let's hear them.
First, stay informed. Seek out reputable news sources. Engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different viewpoints. It's crucial to challenge our own assumptions. And be open to hearing perspectives that you know might differ from our own.
Makes sense. It's easy to get caught in those echo chambers and filter bubbles where we only hear what we want to hear.
Exactly. Second, support organizations that align with your values. Organizations that are working to strengthen democratic institutions or promote civic engagement. There are so many groups out there doing incredible work on issues like voting rights, election integrity, and government accountability.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's strength in numbers. And by supporting these organizations, we can amplify their impact. What else?
Third, engage in the political process. Vote in every election from local to national. Contact your elected officials. Let them know your concerns. Attend town hall meetings and community forums. Hold them accountable for their actions. And demand that they uphold democratic principles.
You mentioned holding them accountable earlier, and I think that's a key point. It's not about blind loyalty to any party or ideology. It's about demanding that our leaders act with integrity and serve the best interests of the people.
Exactly. We need to be vigilant watchdogs,
Right.
not passive cheerleaders. And if our elected officials fail to meet our expectations, we need to make our voices heard.
So voting, contacting our representatives, staying informed, these are all important steps. But what about those who are feeling more radicalized? Those who believe the system is so broken that it requires more drastic measures.
That's a very complex issue. It's important to acknowledge that frustration and disillusionment with the political system are real and valid, but I would caution against resorting to violence or other actions that undermine the rule of law.
Right. I think it's important to remember that democracy is a process, not an endpoint. It's messy and imperfect.
Yeah.
But it's also the best system we have for ensuring a just and equitable society.
I agree. And ultimately, the best way to protect democracy is to participate in it, to hold it accountable, and to work to make it better.
I like that. It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our democracy. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you hope listeners will leave with?
I want to emphasize that despite all the challenges we face, there is still hope. The future of American democracy is not predetermined. It will be shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the commitments we make to uphold its core principles.
That's a powerful message. It's not about giving in to despair or cynicism, but about channeling our energy and our passion into constructive action. So what's one concrete action that listeners can take today to engage with this issue, to protect democracy, or simply to feel less overwhelmed by it all?
I would encourage everyone to find an organization that's working to strengthen democratic institutions or promote civic engagement, something that really resonates with them. Offer your support, whether it's through volunteering, donating, or simply spreading the word. Even small contributions can make a big difference. Remember, we're all in this together.
That's a great suggestion. And as always, we'll provide links to some relevant organizations in our show notes. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a complex and timely issue. Remember, the future of democracy is in our hands.
Indeed it is. Let's make sure we rise to the challenge.